Okay, we're getting started a bit late and people will start wandering in, but we have a very full panel. We have four excellent speakers and who have made important contributions to our subject, which is fiscal and monetary issues, their interaction, et cetera. John Cochran, Debbie Lucas, Charlie Plosser, and Pat Kehoe. I'm going to be much more ruthless than previous moderators uh, by limiting everybody to 10 minutes because we'll try to get close to, we're supposed to be done by 5 o'clock and it's 5 to 4. So we like to leave some time for questions and the inevitable 1 or 2 minute overage when I say time's up. Okay. So we'll do the best we can. And if we go a little over, I'll apologize. I'm Michael Boskin, Stanford Economics Department at Hoover Institution. And having listened to some of the panels, I apologize I missed some of the morning because I was having my eyes dilated. And if I call on somebody later and you're a good friend and I don't recognize you, that's because my eyes aren't fully recovered. I do want to mention that this occurs against this discussion, and the discussion this morning occurs against a backdrop of a much richer intellectual history than we were able to discuss so far, including around what the national debt does and deficits do. We'll hear more about that in a moment. That includes three Nobel Prize winners who thought that the major thing about the debt was it had real effects because it decreased the apparent price to taxpayers about what the cost was of funding spending. We've had Ricardian equivalence reborn. We've had Jim Tobin saying it's very different types of characteristics of federal debt facility features of the debt, maybe especially now that we have TIPS. We've had a long history of experiments with different evaluations of them and the like. And we even all the way up to Olivier Blanchard's presidential debt address to the AEA, basically saying, don't worry about the debt, we can roll it over forever. It kind of is not that big a deal. I kind of deconstructed that in the papers and proceedings the next year, but if you're interested, I'll send it to you. It doesn't really hold up. The assumptions are all pretty bad, and we've run the experiments, and interest rates eventually got above the growth rate. So any event. Also, much of what's about to occur, I think, deserves to be, we deserve to mention a few things that have happened. The most important thing is the immense explosion of the national debt in virtually every major economy and society. And secondly, the tremendous change in what governments are spending on. When I was an undergraduate, it was still the case that the majority of federal government spending was on purchases of goods and services. Now, unfortunately, we're going to need to increase defense spending in a dangerous world, but that's a sideshow. The government really is a redistributor of resources. You might say it's a fiscal cross hauler between people in their peak earning years and their retirement, or from a little bit to the poor, but mostly big transfers, especially via social insurance and unfunded entitlements to the middle class. And I think it's probably worth just saying, if you pardon me from exercising my own opinion about this, since we're primarily borrowing these days for subsidies, transfer payments, tax credits, and things of that sort, it's worth remembering the original purpose of the federal debt, according to Alexander Hamilton, who argued for the federal assumption of Revolutionary War debt by the states, from the states, because it was, quote, the price of liberty. So governments have changed. There are many other things, if I have a chance, I'll mention that would affect this discussion. But I think it's worth having that in mind as we hear this important discussion of the role of fiscal policy and inflation, and fiscal policy and monetary policy. So I'm old enough to remember when, and perhaps to get away with, saying ladies first. So Debbie, I'm going to call on you first. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll just jump right in. I think that many of you here today are going to agree that the Fed and other central banks as well should avoid crossing the line from monetary to fiscal policy. That is for a variety of reasons. As Paul Tucker has eloquently argued, it cedes democratic control over fiscal policy to unelected officials. And in the US, there's no constitutional authorities to do so. It also risks central bank independence should things go awry with those policies. However, there's no general agreement over how to or where to draw the dividing line. In my view, questions about which central bank policies cross the line into fiscal policy and what should be done about it are some of the most important and most under-discussed issues in central banking. I've circled back to these issues several times in presentations I've made at the Shadow Open Market Committee, changed my mind a few times, but I want to return to them again briefly today. So what I'm going to do is revisit alternative definitions of when a Federal Reserve action is actually fiscal and suggest what a preferred definition I'd like to work with and the reasons for that. I'm going to provide a few examples of Federal Reserve policies that I think have clearly stepped over the line into fiscal, and also highlight a few policies where I think some people have described them as fiscal, but by my definition, they really aren't. Finally, I'm going to highlight the large, albeit indirect, but misleading fiscal effects from how the Fed remittances are accounted for in the fiscal budget. And then I'll suggest at the end that really, at least the first step in the remedy of all of these things is towards greater transparency and better measurement of fiscal policy effects of what the Fed does. Okay, so let me just start with two definitions I'm going to state and dismiss. So if you look at Wikipedia or even the Fed's own definition of what a monetary policy is, they'll basically say monetary is what central banks do. The Federal Reserve actually says monetary policy is the Federal Reserve's actions as a central bank to achieve three policy goals specified by Congress. So in other words, if the Fed does it, it's monetary. And kind of similarly, if you look at definitions of fiscal policy, it usually refers to tax and spending policies, and the emphasis is again on the agent taking the action and the types of actions undertaken. So this kind of definition based on actors and specific types of actions are clearly not helpful for drawing an economically meaningful line between the two types of policy. Well, in the past, I was very sympathetic to the idea that a central bank policy action is fiscal if its real and distributional effects can be replicated with tax and spending policies. However, if you think about that definition for a few minutes, you'll probably convince yourself that it causes all monetary policy to be fiscal. And I think perhaps there's an element of truth in that description, and that in fact, monetary policy is simply a carve out of certain fiscal policies. But nevertheless, that definition also isn't helpful in identifying the monetary policies that make the largest and most troubling incursions into the fiscal realm. My preferred definition is then that a central bank policy action is fiscal if it causes a direct transfer of value to or from the federal government. This definition purposefully creates a parallel between how traditional fiscal policy actions, taxes and spending are quantified in the federal budget and how the fiscal actions of the Fed also could be. And importantly, I'm emphasizing direct transfers here because I want to emphasize that I'm excluding pecuniary externalities from the definition of what makes a central bank action fiscal. So for example, an open market purchase that lowers interest rates has a pecuniary externality that affects the government because it lowers the cost of new treasury borrowing. That benefits the government at a cost to savers. However, I want to exclude that kind of an effect for several reasons. The first is that, as the example I just mentioned showed of lowering interest rates, pecuniary externalities are exactly how conventional monetary policy operates. So I don't want to redefine all monetary policy again as fiscal policy. But second, the size and duration of pecuniary externalities are very hard to assess. Evidence of this is the continuing debate over the efficacy and size of the effects of quantitative easing. The third reason is kind of pragmatic. I want to create a level playing field between fiscal policy as it's conducted by different parts of the government. So I want to use a similar definition for monetary fiscal actions as for other agencies doing fiscal actions. Okay. So let me be a little bit more concrete about what I think is implied by this definition. I want to give an example of two Fed policies that I think have had significant fiscal costs, and that haven't really been recognized as significantly stepping over a line. So let me start out first with the cost to taxpayers of above market interest rates that's paid on reserves. And it's interesting to me as I was listening to the last panel that kind of touches on similar issues, but in a slightly different way. So we know that the government now pays out, or not now, but it has in the past paid out an above market interest rate to private entities when it pays an above market interest rate on reserves. It's a type of government spending. To be specific, in the wake of the GFC and the Great Recession, the huge growth of Fed's balance sheet was financed by reserves. Those reserves were easily attracted. Why? Because the Fed had the newly granted power to administratively set the interest rate that it paid on excess reserves. So the question of how much subsidy is really the question of how much above market rates was that interest that was paid. It's hard to answer that question precisely because it's not clear what the right reference interest rate is. But here I'm taking the reference interest rate for illustration to be the 3-month T-bill rate. And so what's on this plot is the difference between the interest that was paid at the time it was interest on excess reserves relative to the 3-month T-bill rate. And if you add it up over the 10 years I'm looking at here, which is 2008 to 2019, the total comes to about 30.6 billion of additional interest over the market rate relative to the 3-month rate, relative to the overnight. It was somewhat more, about 40 billion. Another way you can look at it is, again, this kind of came up before, but something else that happened over that period is that banks were getting this above market interest rate on reserves, and then those institutions that couldn't go directly to the Fed were lending money to the banks in order to get part of the benefit of that above market reserve rate. And so you could ask the question, well, what's an estimate of how much money was transferred effectively from the government to those banks? And doing a calculation then relative to the Fed funds rate, you get an estimate of about 21 billion. Another issue then is that the Fed has increasingly participated in credit policy, and these policies at times expose the Fed to significant fiscal risk and costs. I think that practice started for the first time on a large scale during the GFC, and then it accelerated during COVID. So the policies I have listed here were authorized under the CARES Act, which directed the Fed to create several new facilities that authorized it to directly lend to businesses and municipalities. And they really had a lot of lending capacity under those facilities, about 1.8 trillion of authority to purchase securities in total. Of course, they purchased much, much, much less than that. Things got better, but there was a large risk exposure. And if you there have been estimates that have been done by me and others that looked at things like the Main Street Lending Facility and assessed the multi-billion-dollar cost to the assistance was given, despite the fact that the Treasury was in a first loss position because the Treasury wasn't granted enough resources to cover all contingencies. Maybe more provocatively, I want to suggest that that my definition leaves some Fed activities on the monetary side of the line that some of my colleagues on the SOMC would instead argue are crossing the line. And I want to briefly mention an important category of those policies, although there isn't going to be time to do justice to the other side of the debate. So I'm going to assert that when central banks buy private sector securities at market prices, say MBSs or corporate bonds in the secondary market, those actions are not fiscal. That's because those are essentially zero NPV transactions if you ignore pecuniary externalities. The government receives securities that have an equal value to what it pays out. So of course, these transactions could be a bad idea for a lot of reasons, and I think often they are, but still they do not create direct fiscal costs or benefits. Another thing that I'll mention is that a lot of the lending facilities that the Fed creates I would also not consider fiscal simply because there's enough backing either by the Treasury or by collateral requirements and so forth. So there isn't significant cost left to the Fed. And perhaps surprisingly, just to name one thing on this list, the ones in bold are from the pandemic. The ones above it are carries over from the GFC. But in any case, the Paycheck Protection Program cost about $700 billion, and it was administered by the Fed, yet it wasn't a Fed fiscal action because the Treasury bore that cost and it was recorded properly in the budget. So it's a fiscal action that I would argue the Fed shouldn't have done for appearance purposes, because a lot of people still come away with the perception that it was fiscal and the Fed would, is to some extent blamed for it, but it wasn't fiscal under that definition. So the last thing I want to mention as having important fiscal effects, albeit indirect ones, is the way that Fed remittances are accounted for. And so I would say that this is not the fault of the Fed directly, but rather a flaw in the rules governing federal budgetary accounting. But nevertheless, it creates very large fiscal distortions, and it's not a problem that the Fed has tried to correct. At least they haven't done it publicly. So the issue is that the Fed's remittances are booked as revenues in the federal budget and thereby create fiscal space that reduces the budget deficit and accommodates higher spending. And these apparent profits have grown as the size of the balance sheet has grown. So why is this a problem? Well, it's because that additional fiscal space is illusory. The Fed earns a higher rate of return on average on its assets than it pays on its liabilities, but that difference is not an economic profit. The profits are easily understood to be illusory because the action of buying, say, 100 million of Treasury securities with 100 million of reserves is clearly, again, a zero NPV transaction. It neither creates nor destroys value. What's happening is that the risk premiums and the term premiums are being booked as profit when in economic terms they're not. It's well understood, in fact, in budgetary circles that this type of accounting creates a paper money machine for the government that in principle could be used to essentially wipe out all deficits. So I'll do this really quickly. Okay, so how big are the distortionary effects on the budget of this remittance accounting? Well, from the period of 2013 to 2023, it was about $790 billion. Over a longer period, it's more than $1 trillion. And as was discussed earlier, now the remittances have gone negative, which itself has its risks, perhaps to the Fed's independence. So I'm sure I'm out of time. So let me just say that in terms of what should be done, it seems just clear that greater transparency and clearer thinking about fiscal and distributional consequences of the Fed's policy is essential for several reasons. The Fed needs to be held accountable to the public and its elected representatives for its fiscal actions. If it had to acknowledge them, to quantify them, it would force it to adopt a more explicit cost benefit mindset in deciding on its policy actions. It could protect the Fed from being pressured to take actions that fiscal authorities didn't want to do themselves. And in the end, it might help protect the Fed's independence. So hopefully the Fed will move in the direction of devoting more resources and staff to addressing these sorts of questions. And more broadly, it would be great if the government would harmonize and improve the fiscal and monetary accounting practices to make them more transparent and move them closer to the economic reality of the situation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about some lessons from optimal monetary and fiscal policy. And this is joint with Chari, Juan Pablo Nicolini, and Elena Pastrino, who's with Hoover here. Chari and Nicolini were in Minneapolis. Sensible policies are formulated as rules. As John Taylor taught us, it's not sensible to ask, what should we do today? It is sensible to ask, what rules should we adopt and stick to? He successfully applied this reasoning to determine a practical monetary rule, which is justly famous. We should follow John's lead and find a practical fiscal policy rule. Current fiscal policies violate basic principles for optimal rules, as Mike Boskin alluded to in his opening remarks. So I'm going to discuss how we should finance government spending with taxes, debt, and inflation from theory. Then I want to contrast what these desirable fiscal policies are compared to how we have actually financed it. And my punchline is going to be, we need major changes to how we're currently conducting fiscal policy to avoid future inflation, and at worst even, potential default on debt, directly or indirectly. So what are the prescriptions for optimal fiscal policy from theory? The premise is that present value of revenue should equal the present value of expenditures. And like Mike started with, I'm not a big fan of if the interest rate is less than the growth rate, we should go on a fiscal bonanza that Olivier Blanchard argued. I think that's absolutely crazy. We maybe come back to that in the comments. So I'm sympathetic with what Mike said. I'm going to presume that throughout. So from Lucas Stokoe, which is the theory paper, and some of my work with my friends, which was an applied paper, I'll put them together and I'll argue that it's desirable to keep labor taxes, tax rates, and tax revenues roughly constant to smooth tax distortions over time. For the same exact reason you want to smooth consumption over time. It's costly to have things go up and down for consumption. It's costly if tax rates go up and down because of concavity, and you want to keep them pretty smooth. So if you follow that rule, what are the implications for debt? Oh, throughout, I'm going to talk mostly about wars, because if things are going right, war should be the main thing you're spending money on in surprise ways, and that's what you should be using debt for. I'm going to start with perfectly foreseen wars to make it real simple. So you have a cyclical, deterministic war-peace cycle. You have war for a while, then you have peace. You have war for a while, then you have peace, to make it simple. What's the plan for labor taxes and debt? Well, the same constant tax rates in peace and in war. So you have a current stream of revenues. You don't want them to go up and down. You don't want to raise taxes like crazy in a war. That's the last thing you want to do. So in peacetime, you run down the debt to prepare for the war. In wartime, you issue new debt to pay for the war. I'm going to argue that historically, Britain followed something close to the Lucas Stokoe plan for debt management for over 200 years. Here's a picture. This is the ratio of real public debt to trend GDP in Britain from 1700 to 1918. It's a picture from Barrow's article. Now, they weren't perfectly foreseen, but they knew there were some wars coming. And if you look at the first 120 years, they ran debt up during the wars. Then the next 100+ years, they ran it right back down during peacetime. At the end of the piece, now look at the numbers. At the beginning of the in the 1700s, it was 20%. The ratio of debt to GDP was about 20%. It got up to 140%. And they ran it right back down to 20%, just in time for World War I, and they did it all over again. That's what Lucas Stokey says. And they kind of did it. How about stochastic wars? We know we're going to have wars. We know they're going to recur. We don't know exactly when they're going to occur. So think of them as probabilistically, but you know they're coming. Now the Mott theory has a little bit more implications for inflation. It's still desirable to do the same thing on the tax revenue side. You still don't want taxes to go up and down. You want them pretty flat. You do not want to raise taxes during the war. You want to smooth out tax distortions. But now you want a way to make the debt, you want to use the debt to vary with the state. So you want to transform nominal debt into some kind of real debt. You basically want to sell the people IOUs, and you want to get the money when you need it and pay out the money in peace when you have it to pay them back, loosely speaking. So you want to move resources from peacetime states, we have a lot of revenues, not much spending, to wartime states, we have a lot of spending and flat revenues. And also, you don't want to distort people's savings ahead of time by having ex-ante distortions. And this is the subtle part. You need to balance the inflation in the states when you need it with deflation in the other states, so that someone lending you money ex-ante, you're not distorting the returns they get, or they might not even give you the money to start with, because you're going to try to burn them at the end and inflate it away. So the average returns on nominal debt shouldn't be distorted, and this is in theory. You might ask, so that's the same plan, I'll just summarize, the same plan for revenues, run down the debt, pay for the war, issue new debt. Now the plan for inflation is, when war breaks out, it should be well understood that you're going to inflate away some of the debt to get some revenues. And when peace is restored, and this is the hard part, you should actually deflate. You shouldn't try to inflate it away. You should actually deflate to fulfill your promises to give the debt holders a reasonable rate of return on their money. That's not always what happened in practice. You're not going to raise revenue from this overall, because you're going to give the outside people a fair rate of return. And you just want to transfer resources from peace to war. That might sound a little bit extravagant. Is it even feasible? Well, there's some nice historical evidence on optimal inflation policy under the gold standard. Let me talk about that. So Mike Bordeaux, who's my go-to macro historian when I want to get some feeling for what actually happened, along with Finn Kidlin, a long-term co-author, have some nice paper on implementing this policy under the gold standard. Now, simplistic view of the gold standard is it stops inflation. You have a constant price of gold to fiat currency. If you do it right, inflation stops. The gold bugs say, go back to this, because they have some fuzzy ideas of what happened. They think inflation was constant. It wasn't. So they should read a little bit. So in practice, the gold standard was suspended during the war to decrease the value of the local currency and induce inflation. So you weren't paying out much money when you didn't have it. But the whole promise was, you know I'm going to do that, me being the government, but I'm going to commit to return to the pre-war parity during peace. And Winston Churchill, who I admire very much, tried to get out of this, and he wasn't allowed to in England. He wanted to inflate away all the debt. So Mike and Finn argued that Britain, France, and US implemented a policy just like this. In World War II is one example, and some, they go earlier to World War I and earlier. So they suspended the gold standard, but then returned to the pre-war parity. And the returning to pre-war parity is the hard part, because it means deflating and paying the debt holders what they, quote, deserve. The key message, this is a quote from them, the commitment to return to the gold parity after the war enabled the authorities to issue debt and collect seigniorage at much more favorable terms. Okay, so that's like, they did actually try to do that. Now, why might fiscal policy matter overall? And this is, I'm sympathetic to what Mike started with, and I should learn this quote that government debt is the price of liberty. So Sargent and Veldy have a nice paper about France and England. They fought many wars. Even though you would have thought the French would have won, maybe they have a population 4 times as big. They're a bit poor, but you should think they should, all else equal, should win most of the time. But England won every time, except for the American Revolution, where they were helping the Americans, and we won that one. Norton Weingast is here in history. He argued that fiscal policy institutions matter. The English Glorious Revolution eliminated the king's ability to do lots of things. They give a lot more power to the people. In particular, it eliminated their ability to unilaterally default on debt. In France, there were no such institutions. So French kings would coerce the nobles into giving them money and then systematically default after the war. French nobles got tired of that and stopped coughing up the money. So Britain, because of these institutional differences, raised more funds to France to fight wars. And what I want to emphasize is perhaps the English fiscal policy helped win the wars with France by enabling them to get the money when they needed it. Well, now how about us being the US? Have we been as responsible as the people we talked about, Britain, US during World War, some of these other countries? Well, let's take a simple look. Federal debt is a share of GDP. Here's the historic path. After World War II, we're up to about almost 120% GDP per capita. And we did what Lucas Stokey argued, run down the debt during the peacetime. We ran it down from over 100% down to about 20%. We call that period the sane, sober, and responsible period. Now, to be honest, there was a little bit of repression, a little bit of ex post inflation, jamming the stuff in, but I'm going to look back with a bit rose-colored glasses to our greatest generation and say they did the right thing. Then after that, we got into a Cold War with the Soviet Union, so that was another mini war. We ran back up the debt. That's fine, that's part of the plan. But then we were responsible again. During this peacetime, we ran actually primary surpluses and ran it back down. Now we're down to 30-ish, which seems like a reasonable number. But here's this problem, the problem that we call the age of irresponsibility. The debt went from 20-some%, now it's like 80, and it's going to keep going up. Now, if you look at some of the CBO and the OMB projections, we call this projected bipartisan irresponsibility. Both parties, one party wants us cut taxes but keep G. The other party wants to raise G like crazy and keep taxes. Both are irresponsible. That's projected to reach unprecedented levels. And if you keep going, it's going to 200% of GDP if you believe some of these forecasts. And these are conservative, actually. How do we build up that debt? Well, it's kind of obvious. We consistently spent more than we raised through taxes during peacetime, not running it down. These should be the other way. So there's 2 lines. Look at this line. The blue line is how much we're spending. The green line is how much we're taking in. During peacetime, they're supposed to be the other way. And in peacetime, it's still getting big. Okay, what's the root of the problem? Well, John Kogan has a nice book entitled The High Cost of Good Intentions. And the key idea is, even though there is a noble purpose of assisting people who through no fault of their own are destitute, neither tax revenues nor revenues generated by growth, the G part, have been able to keep pace with this amount we're spending, bringing national debt to a record. And I emphasize during peacetime, you should not be running record debt to GDP during peacetime. He has a nice story about even the Civil War veterans are still getting money through their descendants' plans now, 100 and whatever it is, 6 years later. He argued since World War II, the federal spending to GDP went up 6%. All of it is accounted for by entitlement spending. Everything else went down, including defense as a share of GDP. City's current high spending, low tax regime is just not feasible. We must choose between a modest welfare state, low spending, low taxes, or a high welfare state more like Europeans with high spending, high taxes. I personally favor the first, but that's a matter for society to decide. What's the key lesson? Keep your powder dry. History tells us we will have wars. Having fiscal capacity to raise our spending and fight them is help deters our adversaries. And if we don't deter them, we have to go through with it. What's the future? Well, we have lots of things in our future, and we always will. Will China invade Taiwan? Will Russia invade Poland? Maybe, I don't know. We should be prepared for that. This precautionary theory, so to speak, of maintaining fiscal capacity so you can have the money when you need it. That's what I mean by keep your powder dry. And if so, will we rule our current responsibility? Remember, France versus Britain. We want to be like Britain. We don't want to be like France. So why does monetary policy matter? Let's talk about some lessons first, and let me bring it back. So there's a lot of studies of historical inflations. Nearly every single one had two forces: irresponsible fiscal policy and monetary authority that bowed to the pressure to monetize the debt. Who documented that? Tons of people. Some of my favorites are Tom Sargent's famous paper on 4 big inflations, and George Hall and Sargent have about 6 papers that go painstakingly through it. Tim Keogh and Nicolini have this nice book of Latin America, and they go through the Latin Americans' experiences, and it's always the same two: irresponsible fiscal, monetary authority gives in. So what should the monetary authority do in the face of irresponsible fiscal authority? The key thing is resist pressure to monetize, stick to something like a Taylor rule, and don't give in and just monetize. So we shouldn't be enablers of reckless fiscal policy. Let the debt go up until you get political pressure to reduce it. Brazil did that during the Real plan. They just hardcore stopped inflation, let the debt go up, and fiscal reforms eventually brought it down. And they got out of a hyperinflation. Concluding, fiscal and monetary policy are obviously intimately connected. But the root of almost all the problems historically is the imprudent fiscal policy. Once it's fixed, monetary policy is easy. Keep us more or less stable price level. A little bit of stuff over the cycle, but that's peanuts. Adopt balanced budget rules, maybe this is an idea, as though if fiscally responsible states separate, one way they do it is separate the operating budget, the current spending, from the capital budget, long-term investments, impose a balanced budget on the operating budget. Do not have some limited escape clauses. This is not my area of expertise, but I was reading about Utah. They seem to be doing a decent job. In the meantime, resist the pressure to monetize the debt. Let the deficit build up if you're a monetary authority, and hopefully you'll get pressure. That dynamic has played out numerous times. Hopefully it will again. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, but Michael's got us on a tight schedule, so I'll not try to be more welcoming than that at this point. This has been a fascinating day, and the panel and the last 2 panels and all of them have been great. And I'm going to try to cut short some of my remarks because I can just say, see Pat Cheeho, see Loretta Mester, see Bill Nelson. The debate over the appropriate relationship between monetary and fiscal policy is really an old one. However, it's really taken on a lot of renewed interest since the crisis of 2007 and 2008, as both the Fed and the Treasury have initiated policies that breached the accepted norms that had largely been in place since the Treasury-Fed Accords in 1951. My view is that these new policies have undermined the institutional arrangements intended to support the independence of our central bank and frayed the boundaries between monetary and fiscal policies. In two papers by Tom Sargent in 2010 and 11, he wrote about the history and the struggles of economists and economic theorists to provide guidance as to where to draw the lines between the markets for money and the markets for credit. And that's a quote. He characterized these challenges as trying to balance, and again I quote, stability versus efficiency. Ambiguities, uncertainties, and the path forward arise partly because the choices are difficult and involve conflicts of interest that thrust us beyond macroeconomics and into politics, unquote. I don't pretend to answer these deep conceptual problems that Sargent describes, but I do take seriously the view that choices involve conflicts of interest, particularly among government agents, and political economy issues that have important implications for how we think about drawing these lines. The economic historian Douglas North was recognized for his work for the Nobel Prize on the role that institutions play in economic growth. He argued that institutions arise as a way for heterogeneous actors to constrain interactions among parties, both public and private, to ameliorate frictions and other hard-to-resolve conflicts of interest. These institutional arrangements take the form of laws, contracts, business and corporate arrangements, and even institutions that establish the constitutions that establish the institutions of our government. The evolution of central banks can be viewed in the same light. Central banks have been around a long time, and the institutions have evolved. The gold standard, for example, served as a commitment device that tied the hands of central banks and the fiscal authorities in ways that helped define the boundaries between monetary and fiscal policy by limiting the scope and potential conflicts in a particular manner. The collapse of the gold standard provided governments with the freedom to use the printing press, that is, fiat money, as a means to finance government spending. It also heightened the stability versus efficiency conflicts of interest and tensions. That conflict was, of course, the tension between short-term political demands to finance government budgets and the longer-term demands for a stable currency. Now, while technology and other innovations have changed over time, this fundamental conflict remains at the heart of the institutional design of a central bank and the desire to establish boundaries between monetary and fiscal policies. Thus, the independent central bank has arisen as an institutional response to these conflicts of interest and political problems alluded to by Sargent. Now, the desirable degree of independence is achieved by limiting the goals and powers of the central bank and of the fiscal authorities, for that matter. To do that in ways that seek to address these thorny conflicts of interest. Of course, governments always maintain the upper hand since it can change the law. But the idea is to make the institutional arrangements the commitment enough to make that changing of the laws an expensive power to exercise by the government. Put differently, the institutional arrangements seek to tie the hands of both monetary and the fiscal authorities in ways that make those commitments credible. The new threats to the Fed independence have largely arisen due to the important changes in the use of the Fed's balance sheet, initiated by the Fed itself and by the fiscal authorities. Some actions were intended to influence the allocation of credit and are a form of fiscal policy that turns private liabilities or into public or taxpayer liabilities. Other actions by the fiscal authorities explicitly tapped the Fed's balance sheet to fund off-budget spending. The Fed and Treasury also exploited emergency provisions in the Federal Reserve Act to lend to and to bail out private institutions and investors in a manner never before exercised. Applications of this practice lacked systematic guidelines, little in the way of restrictions that contributed to moral hazard and incentivizing more risk-taking rather than stability. These actions and others contributed to the breaking down, in my view, of the boundaries between monetary and fiscal policy. So I want to touch briefly on three interrelated and similar aspects of the institutional framework that helps draw the lines between monetary and fiscal policy, and how those events and policy choices adopted during the subsequent to the 2007 and 8 recession are affecting this delicate balancing act of the conflicts of interest that exist. So I want to talk briefly about governance, briefly about mandates and scope of responsibilities, and a little bit about the limitations or constraints on the authorities granted the bank. First, governance. Political failures in the early attempts to establish a central bank in the U.S. were very distasteful and took nearly 3/4 of a century after the closing of the second bank in the United States before Congress tried again. The result, of course, was the Federal Reserve System. It was designed as a decentralized institution with geographical dispersions of semi-private reserve banks and a board of governors in Washington. Part of their motivation for this setup was to decentralize and make decision-making more diverse, less focused on the financial centers at that time of, let's say, New York and the short-run politics of Washington. After the collapse of the gold standard, changes were made in the Fed's governance. The Banking Act of 1935 removed the Treasury Secretary and the comptroller of the currency from the Fed's board. It granted 14-year terms to the Fed governors, established a new entity, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, to govern the conduct of open market operations. These changes reduced the role of the fiscal authorities in direct participation in the conduct of monetary policy. But it did grant greater control to the politically appointed board of governors in open market operations. Here we can see the tension and struggles between monetary and fiscal policy and how to draw the boundaries. In some response to the criticism recently of actions taken during the great financial crisis, you can hear suggestions that the Fed needs to be held more accountable. To some, that translates into the Fed needs to be more political. For example, some have argued that Reserve Bank presidents should become political appointees, or they not be allowed to vote on monetary policy matters. This weakens independence. My view is a better way to promote accountability and maintain independence is to be found in limiting or narrowing the scope of responsibilities and authorities of the central bank rather than inviting greater political interference in day-to-day decision-making. What about mandates? Well, Athanasios gave a good discussion of mandates earlier today. Federal Reserve banks and central banks are given a great deal of latitude in the instruments they have, mostly in buying and selling securities. But narrow mandates focus the central bank on well-articulated objectives that make it easier to evaluate the institution's success or failure, and thus to hold it accountable. Narrow mandates also serve to discourage or limit central bank discretion to use its powers or authorities to justify actions that are not related to the mandate. Narrow mandates can also help provide central banks with grounds to resist or to say no when fiscal authorities ask them to do things that stretch too far beyond the mandates. Unfortunately, the trend in the US and other countries, in many cases, is to expand the scope of the mandates. And it pushes them further and further away or into the political arena and the fiscal policy. Again, weakening the institutional framework that is designed to support independence. When establishing the long-term goals and objectives for any organization, it's important that those objectives be achievable. Assigning other unachievable objectives, even within organizations, is a recipe for failure. In the case of the central bank, it could result in the loss of public trust and confidence. For example, in the active pursuit of the maximum employment dimension of the Fed's so-called dual mandate, has been a problem for the Fed and continues to be. The FOMC notes in its statement, I'm going to revert back to the 2012 statement. We could talk about the 2014-20 statement, but I don't want to do that. But essentially, it says the maximum level of employment is largely determined by non-monetary factors that affect the structure and dynamics of the labor market. The statement goes on to say this explains why the Fed does not specify a specific numerical target for the maximum employment. This acknowledges, by the way, appropriately in my view, the weakness of the case that maximum employment constitutes an achievable objective for monetary policy, or that there's a mechanism for true accountability. Lastly, I want to mention operating authorities and restrictions. And this was covered in great detail and very well by both Loretta Mester and Bill Nelson in the earlier session. And there is a case that interest on reserves is a major issue because interest on reserves, in Sargent's words, subverts independence of both the fiscal and the monetary authorities and puts at risk that independence. And so Mike tells me I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip the details, but that discussion was excellent. And the point that many of us have raised, dating back to the early days of going to interest on reserves and adopting a floor system, which in our view, or my view, is very dangerous, and funding a new disaster relief program out of the Fed's balance sheet is a perfect example of what we may be in for if we don't address constraints on that. And the only other point I would like to make is that between 1951 and 2007, when the Federal Reserve Act said that the Fed could not buy private sector securities, could not invest in state and local securities. During 51 to 2007, the Fed pretty much operated a treasuries only policy. And in August 2007, 90% of the Fed's balance sheet was US government securities. In 2015, only 55% of the Fed's balance sheet was US government securities. So it shows you that the composition of the balance sheet has dramatic effects. And one thing to say again is that putting restrictions on what the Fed can do protects its independence. And expanding those authorities, expanding the markets or activities of the private sector and markets is a sure way to undermine Fed independence. And that would be a very big mistake. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
I want to thank my previous panelists because they said 3/4 of what I was going to say, and hopefully that'll spare me from saying it again. Let's get to it. we just had an inflation. Let's root the question in history. There's what you saw. Inflation in just about January 2021 came out of nowhere. The Fed didn't do anything unusual, at least as far as interest rate policy. Interest rates went to zero in the recession like they always do. So where did inflation come from? Question one. Question two, notice inflation plateaued and then eased just about as the Fed started raising interest rates. Why did inflation plateau and ease? Standard theory tells us that if the interest rate is below the inflation rate should continue to spiral upward until the interest rate exceeds the inflation rate. That didn't happen. It started all on its own. And of course, what happens next? Well, I have a theory of this, as you can imagine. Notice what else happened. I plotted here on the right-hand axis, the federal debt during the pandemic, during and after the pandemic, especially the US government handed out $5 trillion of checks to people, $3 trillion of which was monetized. That isn't necessarily bad. There was a big crisis. It's been analogized to a war, but that's what we did, and it had the obvious results. That seems like a simple one. Now, I interpret this through the fiscal theory of the price level. You knew this was coming, but I want to make a plea for it. Of course, this is like exercise 101 from fiscal theory. I also will claim I'm trying to sell a book. There's the pretty cover. And in selling the book in 630 pages, I believe, and I make the claim, it is the only known coherent economic theory of the price level that we have, consistent with current institutions, fiat money, an interest rate target, no money supply control, and our Fed does not make blow up the world equilibrium selection threats. It's the only one we got, so you might as well pay attention to it. How does it digest this episode in a little more detail? It's just price's present value of dividends. The price level adjusts so that the real value of nominal debt is the present value of surpluses. I think that's been said about 3 times. Pat said it for sure on his first slide. Inflation is always too much money chasing too few goods. Just how much is too much relative to the government's ability to soak up money by charging current taxes or by charging future taxes by soaking it up with debt. Now that insight, this is quite different from Keynesian stimulus, because what matters is debt, not debt deficits relative to GDP gap, but debt relative to expectations of future repayment. The long run ability to repay is what makes it inflationary, not the debt itself. The top little chart there shows you good fiscal policy, responsible fiscal policy, in Pat's words. You borrow for the war, you pay back with surpluses afterwards. You can have lots of debt and deficits with no inflation if you're going to repay the debt. That is good, responsible fiscal policy. Government debt is a wonderful thing. It allows you to win wars if you issue it and with promises of repayment and it doesn't cause inflation. Inflation comes when the same debt and deficit is not matched by future surpluses, deliberately or not deliberately. That's how you run a state contingent default via inflation. That's what I think happened in 2021, and that's the important distinction with Keynesian stories. And of course, with long run, inflation can come out of nowhere, just as stock prices can come out of nowhere when information comes out. That's the basic theoretical view here. With that in mind, it's not so easy as just saying big deficit. You have to think about, why do we have debt and deficits? Why didn't people think that it was going to get repaid? Well, when you just look a little bit at the history of this time versus 2008, it's actually plausible. I don't offer proof, but plausible. Congress suspended its pay for spending rules. The zeitgeist of the era was go big, interest rates are low, as Janet Yellen said, R less than G, modern monetary theory, secular stagnation, stimulus, and so forth. I think Jim Bullard's analysis is very prescient. The ARA and the IRA in early 2001 really said, we're not going back to normal fiscal policy. This is not going to get repaid the way we normally do. And then the easing came, as Jim said, exactly when Congress shifted, and we went back to normal levels of irresponsibility. Also, in 2008, we got lucky with negative interest costs for a decade. That is certainly not going to happen again. Now, I've told the story. We actually tell models. This is fiscal theory exercise number 1. What happens if we dump a lot of debt and we don't have plans to repay? To make that clear, here are the equations. This is just a standard new Keynesian model completed with fiscal theory. What happens if we dump some debt, if we have a big deficit and no plans to repay, and the Fed does nothing? Interest rates stay constant. This is just a quantitative version. We tell quantitative parables. This is my quantitative parable. What happens is inflation surges. The interest rate stays low so that the real returns on government debt are low. That's how we slowly inflate away the debt. The price level rises. It's as if the reduction in surpluses makes the price level jump, but then smoothed out through sticky price declines. So here's the lesson. This can happen. Inflation can come from fiscal shocks, even with the central bank doing absolutely nothing. When this event happens, this unfunded deficit happens, there must be inflation to eat away the debt. The Fed can smooth list, you'll see that in a minute, but it cannot avoid inflation like that. Second, notice this inflation goes away. A one-time fiscal shock, I dump 5 trillion on you. Once the price level has gone up, it goes away on its own, even if the Fed does nothing. There is no spiral away. There is an easing even all on its own. That too is consistent with the episode and answers the puzzles of the standard analysis of the period. What about money? That ghost of monetarism has been rustling around in the casket this whole afternoon. How do we differ from, and Peter pointed out the M2 expansion. Now, money and fiscal theory agree. A helicopter drop, a money finance deficit causes inflation. Money is just a form of government debt. The key distinction: does an exchange of money for bonds have exactly the same effect? We both agree, give you 5 trillion, you're going to inflate. But if I give you 5 trillion and take back 5 trillion of treasury debt, does that have exactly the same effect? If you're a monetarist, yes, only the quantity of money matters. If you're a fiscal theorist, we look at the wealth effect, not the portfolio effect. They have the latter has almost no effect. That's the crucial difference. In fact, Friedman's examples, as I think Pat just said, were almost all cases of money financing deficits. Examples, histories where fiscal and monetary agree. But that's the crucial conceptual difference. Well, the ghost of Adam Smith just came down and gave us the most perfect natural experiment to answer this. Again, the experiment: I give you 5 trillion of debt, that causes inflation? We agree. I give you 5 trillion, take back 5 trillion of treasuries. Does that cause inflation? Monetarists, yes. Fiscal theory, no. We just did it. And that's what the graph on the bottom right shows. In the COVID era, 5 trillion, we get inflation. In the QE era, 5 trillion, take 5 trillion back, absolutely nothing. How about other stories for where inflation came from? Monopoly, greed, price gouging, round up the usual suspects, or supply shocks, which were alluded to earlier. Remember, supply shocks are relative prices. They're a relative price shock. The price comes up, it comes back down, and one price relative to something else. They're not the price level unless they induce a monetary or fiscal policy response. And that is true in every model. Every estimate, you see estimates, oh, it was supply shocks or demand shocks. Every one of those models, it cannot raise the overall price level unless it induces a fiscal or monetary policy shock to raise demand. It's always demand that causes inflation, everything going up. So I think, yes, the supply shock induced the government to do war finance and more inflation, but it could have done this and it could have done that. That was the choice. It's always demand. The supply shock is the carrot that leads the fiscal or monetary horse that leads inflation. Do you really want to call this a carrot shock and not a horse shock? So what I want to say more generally about monetary fiscal interest, that was history, makes sense, recent history. Longer history. Has there ever been a substantial inflation that did not come from printing money to cover deficits in a country with good growth, steady primary surpluses, reasonable debt, but the central bank made some sort of technical mistake? I'm overstating these, but pretty much no. Every successful disinflation has combined not just monetary, but monetary, fiscal, and microeconomic policy reforms. And the history of Latin America, as Pat said, is full of monetary reforms that didn't work because they didn't do all the other ones. That's the essence of monetary fiscal interaction. Second point I want to make, this is still the introductory slide. Tighter monetary policy that induces, that reduces inflation. This is the challenge going ahead. when we get inflation again, when, not if, it will happen, the Fed will want to raise interest rates. Tighter monetary policy by raising interest rates to reduce inflation imposes fiscal costs. It raises the interest costs on the debt, and that's not a minor issue. At 100% debt to GDP, 1% interest rate is 1% surplus to GDP that you got to raise to pay the interest costs. Second, if you disinflate, there's a windfall to bondholders. They get paid back in more valuable money. Someone's got to pay that. Third, if you think monetary policy works the way the Fed thinks it works, a softer economy, the Phillips curve, and so forth, it induces less tax revenue, automatic stabilizers, stimulus bailout. It induces fiscal deficits. So monetary policy causes those fiscal expenses. In theory, and I'll survey every theory we know, higher interest rates that do not induce tighter fiscal policy to pay those expenses do not lower inflation. And that's true in every single model we have. What we have is always joint monetary and fiscal. You can't be bothering me already. Okay, so let me show you. This is Sargent, ends of inflation. We solve the fiscal problem, inflation goes away instantly. It's always monetary and fiscal policy. The 1980s, supposedly the great sign of monetary policy, was in fact a joint monetary, fiscal, and microeconomic reform. Look at those high real interest rates. Who paid for those high real interest rates? Answer, we did. There's the primary surplus deficit. And with Social Security reform, with tax reform, with deregulation, with microeconomic reform, the economy grew like crazy, and there were huge fiscal surpluses, which paid those fiscal costs. 1980s was a monetary, fiscal, and microeconomic reform, which together disinflated. That's always the case. This is a new Keynesian model. Yes, I can do a totally new Keynesian model. On the left, the standard three-equation new Keynesian model. There's a monetary policy shock. The Fed lowers inflation. There's inflation on the bottom. See, that's how it's supposed to work. But wait a minute. The interest rate is higher than inflation. There's interest costs on the debt. Who paid those interest costs on the debt? Footnote 4, passive fiscal policy levies lump sum taxes to pay the interest costs on the debt. What if the Fed cannot count on the Treasury to raise lump sum taxes to pay the interest costs on the debt? The top right one is the same new Keynesian model. It is the same path of interest rates. It's a different path of monetary policy shocks. Different monetary policy shocks can give rise to the same interest rates, jiggered so that there is no fiscal policy response. In a standard new Keynesian model, solved in standard new Keynesian ways, if you raise interest rates, but you cannot have a contemporaneous fiscal tightening to pay the interest costs on the debt, inflation goes up. Inflation only goes down if monetary and fiscal policy tighten together, even in the totally standard new Keynesian model. Here is the old Keynesian model, adaptive expectations, the standard Fed story for inflation. So what happens is there's the monetary policy tightens, the interest rate rises, we go down, we follow the Taylor rule, and interest rates go down, chase inflation down, and we get rid of inflation. Standard story for the 1980s. The interest rate is higher than the inflation. The interest costs on the debt rise. Fiscal policy had to tighten in order to pay those interest costs on the debt. If it did not, even the old Keynesian ISLM model, higher interest rates do not lower inflation. This is the best I can do with it. This is fiscal theory again, a higher interest rate with no change in fiscal policy. It can lower inflation now, but only by raising inflation later. I think this is what happened. The Fed raised interest rates. Fed matters in even holding fiscal stuff constant. But all you can do is lower inflation now by raising it later. There's unpleasant interest rate arithmetic. You can move inflation through time. So the Fed lowered inflation immediately, as you saw it does, but you can see at the cost of higher inflation in the long run, you get kind of stuck. Gee, sort of exactly where we are. So let me close, Mike, I see you getting nervous, by talking a little bit about the future. Here are the CBO projections and monetary fiscal policy in the future. CBO projections, as Pat said, they are optimistic. One reason they're optimistic is they assume nothing bad will ever happen. And you can see where we got our debt from now. We got our debt from now responding to the two last once in a century crises. There will be more once in a century crises. So in this fiscal environment, I just said if the Fed wants to raise interest rates to fight inflation, fiscal policy has to tighten substantially to pay all those fiscal costs. And if it does not, the Fed cannot lower inflation. The Fed loses its power to lower inflation in every theory we have. Well, that may well be the problem we face in the middle of the next inflation. The bigger problem, I think, even bigger problem, people look at this and say, oh, some sort of vague debt crisis is coming. I agree with Pat. The problem is the loss of borrowing capacity. Pat said, what happens if China invades Taiwan? Or maybe when? Well, let's draw that out. What's going to happen? Pacific trade comes to an end. Massive economic shock, massive financial shock. What's Uncle Sam going to want to do? Bail out all the banks, stimulus like crazy, and then, oh, we got to rebuild the military stat. Uncle Sam's going to come to the financial markets with 10 trillion of borrowed money, printed money. And with the recent experience in mind, are bondholders really going to fork over 10 trillion of new savings and say, oh yeah, this is great. You're going to pay this back someday with Social Security and Medicare completely unreformed? Or are they going to say, heck no, and the inflation breaks out much faster this time? The loss of fiscal capacity is a fiscal disaster. The bigger, who cares about the inflation? Our inability to meet the next crisis is one big reason. Now, this does not have to happen. This is a self-imposed wound, and I have to close on, yes, I am going to close this time, on something optimistic, which is there is a way out. This leads to, oh, you heartless conservative, you're going to throw grandma from the bus, versus, oh, no, you're going to raise taxes and destroy the economy. What's the way out? The way out is growth. This graph reminds you that the surplus versus deficit of the US government is primarily driven by the level of the economy, not by tax rates, not by spending policies. It's primarily driven by, we need more tax times GDP. Well, rather than rate tax rates, let's raise the GDP. Growth is the magic elixir that allows us to get out of this problem. Yes, you can also tax more effectively and spend a little more effectively, but the easy way out is growth. And growth is the problem. Last slide, I promise. The bottom is potential GDP growth rate. It was 4% before 2000. It's 2% now. It's 0 in Europe. That's like the screaming long-run economic problem. And we're kind of wasting our time with this inflation stuff. But in the meantime, getting back to strong growth would solve the fiscal problem, would solve the inflation problem. Thank you.
We started 15 minutes late, so I'm going to reclaim half that. Ask the panelists to come back up real quickly and we'll take a couple of questions. I want to make a couple of quick comments. Things that, these are the notes I've taken on questions I'd like to ask. The left side's intellectual history, the right side's what's happened in the economy. And I've only been able to ask a small percentage of them, and I'm sure all of you do. So every one of these sessions could have gone twice as long fruitfully with a marginal return that was quite substantial. It's not surprising that I have two current colleagues and one former colleague from earlier in my career on the panel that I agree with almost everything that's been said, almost, not all, but I want to just quickly mention a few and then add a couple of things to take up with questions. First, I think Debbie is really onto something important about improving transparency in our budgeting and our information systems about what's fiscal, what's monetary. We can't really get at what Charlie was arguing for, much greater seriousness about achieving objectives or losing credibility if we aren't able to measure it. And by the way, let me put in a plug for more accurate measures of inflation. We're moving in that direction, but now we have a new frontier about what to do about putatively free goods. That is, for those of you who don't waste your time on the microeconomics of all this, it's quite fascinating, and we'll see where that winds up. One thing that was mentioned by John at the end, emphasizing cost of growth, something that I've been involved in, and I think one of the three big changes in post-war evolution of macroeconomics, which was time horizons, expectations, and incentives, is incentives. And we talked a little bit about incentives in institutions like the Fed, public choice kinds of things. We didn't talk much about marginal tax rates. And I still remember advising candidate Reagan and helping him design his tax policies I'm kind of where 401ks and IRAs came from. But in any event, before we had inflation indexing of tax brackets, there was immense pressure to bring inflation down. And that, there were many reasons to do that, but in any event, that I think was part of the reason why Reagan stuck with Volcker. I think that's important to appreciate, and supported the disinflation plus other things that went on, and John can worry about that. Pat, we have tried fiscal rules. I was involved in one. We've had, when we lost the nominal anchor of a balanced budget, or then balanced budget over the cycle, people proposed, for example, I developed capital accounts for the federal government. We almost got when I was outside advisor brought in by Dave Stockman and Marty Feldstein, we almost got President Reagan to order the OMB to start producing them. But then Cap Weinberger, then Secretary of Defense, went ballistic that we'd be giving the Russians secrets by measuring our depreciation. So accounting can get you in trouble in various ways. In any event, we had Graham-Rudman, which was basically just projecting you get to a balanced budget. Didn't work. We extended it. Same thing happened with Maastricht rules. We put in 1990, we put in a marginal balanced budget rule called a Paygo rule, which I think probably made sense. However, because Bush agreed to a tax hike in that same deal, it got badly discredited. So I think it's important to focus on that as well. I'd also say that I'm glad John is challenging the central bank canon, perhaps as a sufficient, but not necessarily a necessary condition that you got to get the funds rate above the inflation rate. So I think that's something we really do need to grapple with. He has his proposed answer, and we'll see how that penetrates and broadens in the profession over time. Pat, I really like your idea of separating a capital budget from an operating budget. But we've had wars are important, and let's hope we don't wind up in a really major one anytime soon. It's looking risky right now. But we've really underfunded the military for some time, and both in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, now in the Biden administration, whatever you think of everything else they did, as a factual matter, they were trying to decrease real military spending. Some of that may have been desirable. We certainly need to get a bigger bang from the buck in the military. But when you add that to the fiscal pressures coming from the impending insufficiency of Medicare and Social Security, there's going to be a serious reckoning that we're going to have to deal with this. I'd add one final thing, which is that there's a lot of there are many studies by economists. Alberto Alesina, I think, was the main one early on, but many since then, that you're talking about successful disinflations. There's also successful budget consolidations. And the evidence seems to be that they've been overwhelmingly on the spending side of the budget, not on the tax side, as a broad empirical generalization. So I'll end. Let's take 2 or 3 questions, then we're going to have to get on to the next panel. Okay, we've got people in the middle, and I apologize, people on the edges. Maybe we can start in the back row and take those 2 and see if we have time for one more. We'll take all the questions at once. We'll ask the panelists. That's a good suggestion.
Short question. I'm wondering why the fiscal response to the financial crisis did not lead to inflation. Was there an implicit assumption that, in fact, there would be primary surpluses generated then the way that there was not with response to COVID? And then relatedly, given the implication of interest rate policy for deficits and primary surpluses, should interest rates, in fact, have been kept at 0 to minimize the inflation post-COVID? Thank you.
This is a question for John. So FTPL does seem to do a good job of explaining the inflation surge and the disinflation. Now we're close to 2%, and we still see CBO forecasts getting worse and worse. Should we not see inflation going up as a result of that? How do we explain where we are today now that we're seemingly past the inflation surge and disinflation via the FTPL theory?
I'm Jack Rapansky. Back in 2008, the TARP plan, the revised TARP plan, where they did forced loans to banks at a high interest rate, could that have been done by the Fed, or was that inherently fiscal policy?
Japanese debt to GDP ratio is 250%. The BOJ's balance sheet is 140% of GDP. They've monetized probably 60 to 70% of all JGBs. How does that fit into the fiscal theory of the price level, given that inflation is still low and seemingly running out of steam? Thanks.
Okay, so John, several of those were directed at the fiscal theory of the price level. So let's have your concise answer.
Yeah, concise is hard. I will advertise that these questions come up often enough that you can find written answers on my website, an essay about Japan, and a longer essay called Fiscal Histories about what's different between 2008 this time. The short version is there's lots of reasons why Japan is different from the US. And low interest rates is one of the big ones, and we'll see how long that lasts. They are also fragile. And also it's not a distinguishing problem for fiscal theory. Every theory says if it's unsustainable for fiscal theory, it's unsustainable for passive fiscal policy as well. So it doesn't really distinguish theories. But there's a story for Japan. There's also a story for 2008 versus now. History is always a story. But in 2008, at least, we made fun of them, but at least the administration had the decency to say stimulus now, debt reduction later. And nobody even had the decency to say it this time. Together with, they got really low interest rates. Together with, it was much smaller. Together with, it was also direct government spending, not checks to people. And also with, it was a period of very deficient demand. This one was arguably less so. Oh, and somebody's at the other fiscal, sorry, I got the fiscal theory questions. The CBO is why don't we have Zimbabwean hyperinflation now? The CBO is a projection, it's not a forecast. And they say right there, this is unsustainable. This will not happen. We don't know how it won't happen, but it will not happen that debt to GDP goes up like that. Why are bond markets still buying the US debt? I think bond markets think this is a great country. It's a self-inflicted wound. America will surely do the right thing after we've tried everything else the way we usually do. And when they lose that faith is when things blow up.
Very quickly on TARP, it was a completely fiscal action. I think it was about $500 billion of legislative authority. When they decided how they were going to use the money, they decided the only way they could make it really big was to put it at the equity part of the capital structure. So basically, the government was providing very subsidized purchases of things like preferred stock and options from the banks. And I think there's no way the Fed could have had that large credit-related expenditure without, it would have been well, they wouldn't have even contemplated it, is what I would have said. But there was a lot of fiscal authority that went into that bailout.
I would just add one quick thing about the fiscal side and the future paying down the debt. I had a star undergraduate some years ago who won the university-wide prize for the best undergraduate thesis, who concluded through a variety of consistent vector autoregression studies that the most stimulative short-run fiscal policy is one that precisely is consistent with what you're saying in the real economy, not just in dealing with price level and inflation. Unfortunately, went off to Goldman Sachs, made a lot of money and never published it, but c'est la vie in any event. Let's hear a big round of applause for all these great speakers.